today the topic is stereotypes, breaking down stereotypes, and we have the pleasure of inviting Professor Eddie Tay, who will be moderating for this session. Just a few housekeeping things to make you aware of. So if you, I hope that you can all try to mute the button when the poets are speaking, and also if you later on, there's the live caption. If you need it, it's hidden, and you can hide it or display it from your own live transcript button. So I just wanted to introduce Professor Tay first. Born in Singapore, Professor Tay, Eddie Tay, he teaches courses on creative writing and poetry at the Department of English in Chinese University of Hong Kong. He is also involved in the department's masterclass initiative, bringing creative writers to creative writing workshops for secondary school students. He is the author of 4 volumes of poetry, and his first, Remnants, is about renditions of mythic and colonial history of Malaya, as well as homage to the Tang Dynasty poets. A Love for Soliloquy extends his interest in Tang Dynasty poetry, and it also explores the language of eroticism in modern city life. And his other poetry collection includes The Mental Life of Cities, which was a winner of the 2012 Singapore Literature Prize. And the latest one is called Dreaming Cities. So I hand over the event to Eddie.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Welcome to our session on breaking down stereotypes. So this is one of many readings, as you know, that is part of a festival called the Poetics of Home, a Chinese diaspora poetry festival that is taking place from the 22nd of September to the 6th of October. Established and curated by Wasafiri's former writer-in-residence, Jennifer Wong, who we met just now. The festival hopes to connect and showcase established and emerging Anglophone poets writing across the global Chinese diaspora. So core themes of the readings and panels include migration, family, history, experimental poetics, desire, the meaning of home, and the formation of identity across the Chinese diaspora in the UK and beyond. In this session, we'll be exploring how poetry can help break down unjust stereotypes and bring about a greater sense of equality. Our 4 poets today will be reflecting on the dismantling of stereotypes and injustices in our society. So I'll just introduce the poets. Annie Fan is currently reading law at Oxford University. Their work has been broadcast by BBC Radio 3 and appears in Ambit and the Manchester Review, among others. They have been a prize winner in Tower Poetry twice and have won Lancaster University's prizes for fiction and poetry, as well as being commended twice in 4 Young Poets. Lisa Q is an accountant, charity sector leader, and poet. Her debut pamphlet, The Unquiet, came out with Offit, wrote books in 2019. She is one of the 2019-2020 London Library Emerging Writers. She was shortlisted for 2017 Primus Mentoring and Publication Scheme. Her poets have been published in Brittle Star, Butcher's Dog, Ink, Sweat and Tears, Lighthouse, Magma, Obsessed with Pipework, Tears in the Fan, Tears in the Fans, The Scores, The North and Wasafiri, among other magazines and websites. Daryl Lim, our next poet. He's an editor as well, and a translator and a literary critic from Singapore. His first book of poetry is The Book of Changes. He's the co-editor of Food Republic, a Singapore literary banquet, the first definitive anthology of literary food writing from Singapore. I mean, this is about Singapore, right? So surely it's, there's food there. His poems won him the Golden Point Award in English Poetry in 2015, awarded by the National Arts Council. His latest book of poetry is Anything But Human, published by Landmark Books. this year, 2021. Our next poet, Antony Huen, is a poet, critic, and academic. His latest and forthcoming publications include poems in Amber Flora, The Dark Horse, and Harana Poetry, and articles in Early Popular Visual Culture, Hong Kong Review of Books, and the Oxanian Review. He has contributed in various literary projects and events, including Kuwait International Festival of Literature, the Hong Kong-Singapore Digital Travel Bubble Project, and New Defenses of Poetry. With a PhD from the University of York, he is now a research assistant professor at Hong Kong Metropolitan University. So we have 4 poets today, and here's the format. All right, so we'll have Annie to read her poems for us first, for about 10 to 15 minutes. And after that, Lisa will respond to Annie's poems, or maybe ask Annie a question or two. And then Lisa will read her own poems. And after that, Daryl will then respond to Lisa's poems, or maybe ask her a question or two, and then read his own poems after that. And then this will be, he will be followed by Antony as well, who will be responding to Daryl's poems. And then after that, Antony will read his own poems, and then at the end, Annie will respond to Antony's poems, and then ask him a question or two. So I mean, the logic of this is so that there's a bit of dialogue amongst the poets. And at the end of the session, hopefully we have 10 to 15 minutes left, and then we can take questions from the audience. Okay, so if we are okay with this, can we have Annie to read for us, please?
Cool. I thought I'd do a bit of a mishmash. A few of them are about stereotypes around being a woman, and what it means to be a woman. And then I thought I'd end with a slightly more humorous poem about dating white men in Oxford, which is also full of stereotypes, but a bit more tongue-in-cheek, I think. So this first poem I wrote a few years ago, just when I was leaving secondary school, and I did like classics Latin at A-level, and I also grew up within like the kind of Church of England cultural sphere, as it were, and the title Magnificat draws on that. It's the evensong evening service, and it's always sung every night, kind of depending on what church you go to, and it's in praise of Mary, but I've always found that quite fascinating. I think I really struggle to come to terms with like the Immaculate Conception kind of story, and it's based around myths of womanhood and kind of classical myths as well. So this poem is called Magnificat. As you gave Ruth conception, because in class I fainted, they told me this happens, and all the girls unfolded their wings from their blazers. Another biological truth. A womb is the size of a fist. I know this. Icarus flew too close to the sun, hands burning and beyond the redness, his mouth a wound, screaming, wet. You made me from warm wax, so I avoid daylight, planes, damsons, lipstick. I think you were training me to hide in caves, the hollow shells of birds, to become smoke itself, the most unknown part of the body. Glory to yellow throats, glory in mauve plum-like fruit that leak edible bloods. I've stopped naming each month's burning. There are raw, glistening things I sip and pity, the soft bruising that rots, the decay growing into the cupboards like trees of smoke or dark candles. Like any god, you appear from fire and offal, eventually. I was walking, falling, knees among hedgerows, burdock, ready to taste damp metaphor, to see you again. In every refraction on waxy leaves, every bend of thistle and wild wheat, the wrens and their brilliant mirrors. I didn't look at my stomach. I didn't want to see how the forest burned, the same number of men as trees. And the second poem's a bit more about kind of mythical or kind of imagined sisterhood, I guess. I don't have a sister, but I grew up in a fairly kind of white area of the UK, and there were a couple of other Asian British girls at my school, and we kind of had a kind of a little group that felt like a real sense of belonging. And now we're scattered all across the world, but I still think about it quite often. This poem's called How to Invert a Hyperbolic Function, and it's after detention. Take the cone away from the cone and don't applaud it. I like to say that the body is the feat of engineering, how God himself plotted the range of arcs in, these bright mountains and light pollutions. Even if God has never spoken of anything like the night sky, cityscape to cityscape. In my sister's long decade of the kitchen, we shell boiled peanuts, and she says learning the area is all there is, that Kepler himself used a constant for his calculations of Hyperion, hamburger moon. She fries more with steak and laughs and runs around her kitchen, a place that she bought before I was born. My sister who predates the internet. What is it like to know a quasar without accretion, to spin before the vast imagined planes of her cooking in 3D? I like to say every hand that's touched my body is modern maths, German, the word for treme, traum, the fusions. I thought holomorphic and holographic were the same word. Do you know? Does she care? I can add the number one to the number one. New York is the meat of our distance, fashion brilliant in its false orbits, the large kitchen, a dream of every post-racialism and kind of flesh. So what am I eating? A partial differential of my mother, stranger gods and their hypersurface domains. She does not know about the night I ran and threw myself onto a bridge, another feat of engineering. The steel was not New York, a cityscape, an analysis, a girl left unlocked and slipped inside. This is the least remarkable thing. I am my sister's sister. I don't know how to solve the years, the construct connecting us. It took more than a decade of planning to find the God particle. Its science and differentials, a pulling force, to bind earth to light and her to me. And that's that poem. And then this one's about my grandma, who grew up during various revolutions and famines in China. And I remember every time we went to the supermarket, she'd go on about how like nice it is to just be able to shop for everything. And I remember her once telling me about eating bark to survive. So this poem is based on that. My grandmother tells me about a famine. It was July, no June. There were no birds, no children. No hands, you wouldn't know how to boil bark and live. The deadness of mud, how the earth could spit you out alone. And so Britain, we drive to the shops, my body that has never hungered, hers shortened by need over want and made harsh by these sodium lights, city, petroleum fuel, air. I can't see the trees or easy peel oranges, feel unfiltered cold pressed oil my mother likes to buy and fill our plastic bags and better, more for the food bank. That Sunday she tells me about shame and food and unlocks Trussell Trust leaflets from the church office behind the folding divider, and the pastor begins, says won't live by bread alone. And then it's June. I touch the trunk of every tree precisely like the back of my grandmother's hands. I don't know how there are still birds, locks on bins at the supermarket, poverty premium, austerity, hunger, and far away the bark keeps growing, and we drive to the shops on Sunday again and again. I have quite strong feelings about austerity in the UK, but I thought to end on a slightly lighter note, this poem is called Soft Boy Season, and it's all about my dating mishaps whilst at university. So a soft boy, if you don't know, is kind of like the stereotypical, the student who paints his nails, has slightly long curly hair, says he's into feminism, but yeah. So Soft Boy Season, Oxford 2019. Oh, lesser cousin of the fuckboy, less likely a rower, O one who wears unwashed jumpers and mangles proofs, cries into his cosmos and parades shorts even in December. I saw one of you coming down on High Street, socks and sliders, both of which your breed have mansplained to me, and another nearly ran me over, bite basket filled with Apollinaire and Adorno, didn't ring but sang an aria in warning. I nearly died. Tell me why I can't seem to shake the bad poets and wine boys, can't find a single specimen who doesn't play jazz to his cats at night or drinks in graveyards. Even the physics boys have taken up their Austin and Keats, have defied their classification to claim historiographic metafiction from their labs, vibration, communication. Yes, let me live free of Mahler, licks and bad kisses, your opinion pieces and union speeches. Oh, all unfaithful vegans and vegetarians, can I say enough? And those are my poems. Thank you.
Thank
I
you,
just
Annie.
realized I haven't unmuted my mic. Sorry. So thanks, Annie, for reading the poems. So Lisa, I'm just wondering if you have any comments on the poems or if any questions for Annie before you read your poems. Yeah.
Yes, thank you so much, Eddie, and it's just amazing to be here with all the poets tonight. And Annie, thank you so much for your powerful poems. I wanted to ask a question, kind of picking up on the beginning of the theme of today about breaking, and I kind of sense that that's an undertow in your work in terms of puncture and trauma and identity formation. And I just wondered if you had anything that you wanted to share about that in terms of stereotypes and identity.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think that a stereotype can be both, I think, a sword and a shield. It can be quite protective. Sometimes you can kind of wrap it around you if you don't really want someone to get to know you very closely. But I think stripping away the stereotype, even though it is quite powerful, it can be quite a vulnerable experience to kind of sit there as another human being rather than a collection of kind of imaginings and metaphors. And it can almost feel safer to let someone's imagination run away with them than to really show them who you are. And I think that's definitely a theme that runs through my poems.
Thank you so much. I'm really looking forward to hearing everybody else read and to kind of have this discussion. I guess for me, you know, when I was thinking about stereotypes, I was thinking about simplification, because they're a way that people make us one-dimensional, and we're all complex and rich, and it's that personally gives me a great deal of joy in the world. And so in my own work, what I'm really interested in is how poetry can kind of center that complexity, can bring the things that are on the edges and the margins and across borders, and kind of take that into that place. So I'm going to read poems from that kind of really focus mainly on women, picking up on Annie as well, because Annie was reading quite a few poems about women, mainly about strong women, and people who forge their path against circumstances that are not quite right. And I've been thinking a lot about the stereotype for women of Asian heritage of quietude, of servitude. So very much out of that place. I have to say, a lot of my female ancestors were none of those things, which I'm very grateful for. The catch. When he brought that stinky parcel of catfish home from the market, mother-in-law turned her eyes away like swifts skimming across water. My heart is an empty house with its red door swinging wide. I held our little fish, safe from the monsoon, the gossip, the storm clouds hurled and smashed papayas against the shutters. It's impossible to wash the face of our house clean. My great-grandmother was an amazing person, and she's the inspiration for this next poem. She was a migrant, a child bride to a certain extent, and came from the Swatao area, Chao San in Mandarin, to Malaysia. And there's a little bit of Teochew in this poem, which I know for any Singaporeans in this audience will be fine. But for those who might not know, they should be fine in the context of the poem. But the two visitors at the end of the poem are from the underworld. Afterlife. Jalbolo, she'd had to go, steerage wrap on the iron boat from Swatao. She'd refused again and again to bind her feet. Stubbornness landed her an old husband, Nanyang, their dry goods store, years raising 2 sons, one not hers, 6 daughters, grandchildren, Boeng till the very last day. To hold her hand is to hold iron. Laumar's palms are restless. She forges a railroad from room to room. Stationed, she makes pomelos flower. The peeled segments are fragrant. Outside, orchids overflow pots. When Niotao and Beiming call, she escapes under the back door, along the yellow wall, scurrying grey and fast into the lalang. I think we quite often don't see and value the work that's done in the home. And especially if that work that's done in the home is really by people without education and the economic status that, yeah, is quite often centered. So this is a praise poem. It's for Francesca. Francesca, who stood ready at 1 o'clock with fried rice on a plate and Yo's tomato ketchup, who makes sweet and sour pork better than anyone, who taught me how to peel prawns and boil the shells to inhibit the smell and civets from coming to the backyard, who tends the avocado tree, who picks its fruit, who showed me chicken feathers, snakeskin feet, chopped its head, draining rich ruby into a bowl, coagulating, who walks to church daily, strong as bamboo, as persistent, who lives on the hill. Bridge. We accrete buttressing around the hips in this family as we approach our 50s. Our tendons lose their flex over the architecture of bone and tensioned become cables. It takes increasing effort to invert and scratch our toes, to squat down, to sit cross-legged. Finally, it's impossible to recline on the ground. We come to a standstill, our vertebrae settle as stones. With our siblings, the spandrels, we hold up the long span across which our children race their cars towards Canaan. I'm of a generation where I was often told by my elders that, you know, girls aren't as good as boys. I hope that's changed. I hope for people who have come later, and I have a brother, a little brother, I should say. So this poem responds to that. The boy I wasn't carries the family name like a Lang Yao vase, sweeps the graves and burns altar incense, offers roast duck and arak at Qingming. Little emperor, I resented you as an ox resents Maya, paralyzed with loneliness. Every new year I send photos of you in red envelopes to Lauma. She asks after your apple-faced babies. No one calls me outside. Water drips from mossed rock. Bats nibble at the darkness. This girl becomes a sea swallow, my spit cup nest high up the cave wall, fledging above the scent of waves. This poem I chose because it really speaks to the theme of breaking and containment. This time I'm going to translate the Teochew for the non-Teochew speakers in our audience. There are three phrases and they mean I don't hear very well, we're speaking in circles, and you're not listening. Bridled. Days lashed together, long strips around my body, gift wrapped. You say, trust me. You excel at rope work. What happened back? Tell me again. With macrame, create mats, rings, and truss. Knotting is a matter of life and death, especially among sailors. Cords rig our armchairs, footstools, and overhead lights. Suspended, your hands circle. I stutter. My tongue frays, the hitch slips. I kick and kick. Yokes transmit tension. You whisper, the harness holds. And my next poem really picks up on some of the gender stereotypes that you experience in the workplace. I have to say, it came out of an experience of hitting the glass ceiling very hard at work. But it's called immersion learning. Water pervades, flowing into depression, between cracks into aquifers. My daughter looks at silt left behind after the flood. Shells, feathers, a plastic egg, docked against damp twigs, then asks me why at the end of a work meeting, Paul swiveled towards her and spouted, at least you've learnt something. Frequent droplets drill a hole through stone, but I understand. You've learnt some daughters believe, I'll start again. You've learnt some men believe they have the voice of storms, downdrafts of revelation. Daughter, you don't have to imbibe. Truth puts mud in water. You have riparian rights. And daughter, I was flat skin until a saltwater incursion inflated my lungs, gave me the waves shingled raw. To speak against the current is to swim wild. Don't sink into silence. Wind dulls down. Tide turns and returns. Buoyancy is your birthright. By the moon's wet slap. Kicking was your first conversation. You are a strong swimmer. And I'm just going to finish with what for me feels like a really new poem. It's coming out in an anthology of work from Arachne Press about maps called Where We Find Ourselves. It's called A Ship on the Horizon Doesn't Make Me Feel Less Alone. Why are you making my skin a map? Do you think a map gives you the right to tour and traverse each tender point, tidal plunge, and storm between archipelagos? What are you drawing on the map? Where do you think you're putting your X? Do you think your tongue welcome trading along isthmus and isle? You think your map will help me find the way? Your voice is in my ear, closer than I accept, is unwelcome. I refute your missionary position, its overgrown bone pile. Do you think I don't know how? Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Lisa. Daryl, I'm just wondering if you have any comments to make on Lisa's poems or have questions to ask of her.
Sure, yeah. Thank you very much for that wonderful and moving reading. So I had a question. I don't know if it's too big of a question, but it sort of popped up to me as I listened to your poems and enjoyed your lilting Teochew, which really struck home as a Singaporean. I wondered if I could ask you how you negotiate the tension between, I think, in some ways, the inheritance and preservation of Chinese identity, and also the need, I think, in your poems, I think, to liberate yourself from some of that in terms of, views of women or views of daughters. Yeah, maybe you can just say a little bit about that.
That's a really, really interesting question, Daryl, and I think for those of us who aren't centered in either educationally, because we don't have a classical Chinese education, or my family, for instance, there's very little tradition of literacy, for instance. It's very much a kind of a spoken culture. Certainly and those of us who are educated in English, which is a different breaking, a different trauma, with a post-colonial heritage, I think. So inheritances are, I think, for me, extremely complicated. They're not the kind of the straightforward dominant narrative either of any. I think Chineseness is a complicated concept. It's not a one thing or another. And I think also, our kind of perceptions of what roles should be, I think are also complicated. Obviously there is the Madam Butterfly type Asian woman stereotype, but I don't think, from my own personal history and some of the heroines we know of, I don't think it's so simple. So I think we need to reclaim those ancestors of ours who were disobedient, loud, powerful, who traveled, because actually that's for me, I think there was a lot more of migration in previous histories. Obviously, those of us who are in Singapore and Malaysia know because of the Baba Nyonya community, but there's been a huge diaspora for a really long time, and that's a story that perhaps isn't heard so strongly. So I want to reclaim all of those things in my writing and think about them. I don't know if I've gone off on a tangent.
No, I think that's a wonderful sort of response, because I think that significantly complicates the idea of stereotypes and discrimination, because it's not just one type of identity we're talking about. It's sort of many, many negotiated types across many time zones and territories. And I think that's wonderful. And actually, what you spoke about links quite nicely to what I'm going to do for my own reading. So I'm not going to focus. What I'm going to do for this reading is I'm going to read 5 poems, and only one of them is my own. And I will try, although it's a tall order, to give a sense of how Singapore poetry has sort of handled or tackled this theme of or this issue of discrimination. And actually, it struck me, and maybe some of you as well, who are writing in English across the globe, that actually the whole enterprise of English language poetry in Singapore was an enterprise that I think had to fight some level of discrimination or marginalization, because I think when Singapore became independent in the 1960s and even before that, the idea of these colonial subjects writing in English and even coming up with English poetry worth reading was a contested one. So the very idea that I'm here today, able to speak to you in English and speak and read out English poems was itself had to be fought for. So I thought that would be a first good way to start. And then I'll try and bring us through across the various, very, very quickly, across 50 years or so of Singapore history, and spotlight how various poets have handled this theme of discrimination. So the first poem I'm going to read is actually from Edwin Thumboo, really the unofficial poet laureate of Singapore. And he's really talking now about colonial history, and he had to really make a case for Singapore poetry in English. So he's seen very much as the granddaddy of Singapore poets in English. And this poem is called May 1954. May 1954. We do but merely ask, no more, no less, this much, that you, white man, boasting of many parts, some talk of Alexander, some of Hercules, some broken not long ago by little yellow soldiers out of the rising sun. We ask, you see, the bitter curving tide of history. See well enough, relinquish, restore this place, the sun to us and the waiting generations. Depart, white man. Your minions riot among our young in Penang Road. Their officers, un-Britannic, full of service, look angry and short of breath. You hoard on milk and honey, tried our spirit, spent our muscle, extracted from our earth, gave yourselves superior ways at our expense in our midst. Depart. You knew when to come, surely know when to go. Do not ignore, dismiss, pretending we are foolish. Harbor contempt and eloquence. We know your language. My father felt his master's voice, obeyed, but hid his grievous, wounded self. I have learnt that there is an Asian tide that sings such power and through my dreaming side. My father's anger turns my cause. Depart, Tom, Dick, and Harry, gently, with ceremony. We may still be friends, even love you from a distance. So that was Edwin Thumboo's May 1954. The next poem I'm going to read is called Women Without Men. It's by Lgbqt. Really, I think, a pioneering feminist and female poet in Singapore. And I'll let the poem speak for itself. Women without men. Already ringed by daughters and no son, they keep trying and trying still and trying until tired out, afraid of mothering more women, they stop. Contoured by choice, they manage people over the children they can't imagine bearing or diapering, or the women they won't concede lives to. Work pushes old age off. Unused to the new, some not knowing what to do, are afraid, though it may be a blessing that women outlive men, and singleness is theirs again. So that was Women Without Men by Lgbqt, really a seminal female poet in Singapore, and one to really negotiate, I think, having a sort of literary career, an academic career, and also being a mother. And she's a big favorite of mine. The other one, the next poem I think I'm reading is by a very famous poet from Singapore, Arthur Yap, really a pioneering poet in many ways. And I wanted to read him because for a poem that, and for a cause that I don't think he himself would have said that he was very much identified by, but I would say that he made the first quiet foray to do it, and that really is in the field of gay or LGBTQ poetry. And he was never very openly gay or very outward about it, because I mean this was the 1970s and 80s. But this one poem in his book, I think is the first the first sort of, I don't know what the word is, the first sign of the first shoots of gay poetry in Singapore, perhaps. And so oblique, so quiet, so small, but it is the first breach that gives way, I think, to a torrent a generation later. And this is a very short poem. It's just called Your Goodness. And it's significant because it says it's your goodness, but the dedication says for Keith. And I think those who knew that Keith was Arthur Yap's partner. Your goodness for Keith. Your goodness I sometimes light my anger with, is what you have. No one can burn it away. It is not for my discussion. I know near you, I myself feel good. And this is enough for me, my friend. This is a lifetime friendship. The poem is short, inadequate, and except for a word, totally redundant. So that was Afia. Now, of course, the scene is burgeoning, and there are whole anthologies of queer poetry and writing that you can find in Singapore, despite the many other restrictions that queer Singaporeans might have. But this was, I think, to me at least, when I think about queer poetry in Singapore, this is where it started. Two more poems, one more by someone else, and then finally one by myself. I read now this poem called Pantun for a Drink Seller at Newton Circus, and the poet is Aaron Maniam. And I thought, I know this is a Chinese diaspora sort of a festival, but also to sort of I would feel quite strange in Singapore not to talk about racial minorities and sort of the sort of identities that they negotiate. So this poem is quite interesting because Aaron Maniam is Indian, but he doesn't speak Tamil, he's Muslim. So he sort of has this weird melange of influences and sort of things to get around. Basically, he's here trying to tell a drink seller at Newton Circus, which is a hawker center in Singapore, that he doesn't speak Tamil. So it goes, Pantun for a drink seller at Newton Circus. What kind of Indian are you? Apa macam punya mama, he said. I had stammering Tamil, 2 words of Urdu. It seemed hard to get around his head. Apa macam punya mama, he said. In Malay, our one common tongue. It seemed hard to get around his head, and I left my head, and I shamefully left my head hung. In Malay, our one common tongue, I was tempted to ask, what of you? I may shamefully leave my head hung, but at least I'm not one of the few who've abandoned the Sarabat Pata tradition with my stammering Tamil, 2 words of Urdu. I'm not the only revised Mama edition. Just what kind of Indian are you? Okay, so that was Aaron Maniam's Pantun for a Drink Seller at Newton Circus. And I think, finally, I think to return to the topic of writing in English and thinking about Englishes and Chinesenesses and the many pluralities of our identities and the Englishes that we speak, I thought to talk about Singlish, and this is my poem about Singlish, which is the Singapore colloquial dialect, that of English that we speak. And the poem which is by myself, is called On the Impossibility of a Perfect Language, and in parentheses 1819, question mark. It was a moment of minor revelation when a contractor with yellow boots turned up on TV, extolling the fame of his firm and selling Paquet, plosive vela, then shock, laughter, snobbery, official condemnation, final unauthorized dental. Also when Mrs. M, irrepressible and lovely, told me when I was working a month at the studio, slicing up perfectly sized passport photographs from 8 to 5, that she, having taken French at NUS, cringed when the aunties said N block, N block, N block. And then when Mrs. D, imagining herself an ancient champion of the language of Shakespeare, forgetting the bard's own callous wordsmithing, piously hoped that Singlish would never triumph over the dictums of Latinists long dead. To her, confirm plus chop was double plus I'm good. The refutations are many, but one uncited is this improbable island, defying the tyrannical dialect of Beijing, cue my grandfather sighing, lamenting that Canton lost by one fabled vote, refusing to speak well nor be understood. Now, if we learn the perfect language, we would give its vowels unexpected shade, populating it with memories and ghosts of our ancestral tongues, overturning universality with accents, rendering artificial barrenness fertile. For culture is, after all, infection. In essence, then, like that, how can? Okay, that's all from me today. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks, Daryl, for the poems. I mean, it's just wonderful that you are, in a way, presenting Singaporean poetry. And then, you did read one of your own at the end, but, so it's like an introduction to Singaporean poetry. So, Anthony, I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts, questions to ask.
First of all, I really agree with what Eddie has said, because Daryl, I know you are a historian, and you've managed to give us this really impressive account of Singaporean poetry, including your own work. So and you've really touched on so many different themes related to discrimination. I really don't have much to add or to ask about, but maybe if we are looking ahead, what would you say, let's say, based on your observations of the current Singaporean poetic scene, which of course includes your work, what direction is it heading towards, given that you've given us such a kind of mini version of an account of Singaporean poetry, the history of that? So,
wow, that's a thanks for the question. But it's a huge question. I'm not sure I'm entirely qualified to answer. I think like a lot of national sort of literatures which emerged after sort of decolonization, I suspect what will happen now is that the emphasis on being Singaporean is going to be less and less, and Singapore as a nation or as a monolith will become less of a reference point, and then Singapore poetry will just get more diverse as it exposes itself and is exposed to more influence from all over, and then really that decentering from Singapore is going to happen more and more. And I think that's a beneficial turn for all of us. So we're not so obsessed with ourselves, I think. Or that's my hope, at least.
Yeah, so maybe one way how a particular like a country or city-specific poetry, how it defends itself from all the marginalization is not necessarily boasting its own uniqueness, but also to be inclusive and to welcome all these different cultural and other types of influences. So I'm really impressed by everybody's reading, and I shouldn't put it this way, it sounds condescending, but I think I'm kind of the most, how should I put it, the least established among these all as a poet myself. So I'm really happy to be part of this lineup. I'm going to read a few poems, maybe 4 to 5 of them. And when I was revisiting these poems that I've written, I'm thinking of several stereotypes. And let's see if these poems are breaking them down, which is today's theme because of the time differences. So the first poem that I'm going to read, I would say is, you can say it's an act of breaking down the stereotypical image of Hong Kong, let's put it this way. And I wrote it quite a few years back. And last 2 years and so, Hong Kong has been on news headlines all over the world. So it really brought me back to this poem, which is a kind of curatorial take on the history of Hong Kong. It was published in Cha, an Asian literary journal, which Eddie co-edits. The poem was called Remembering Hong Kong as 39 Everyday Objects. And I think I would use this moment to rename this poem as A History of Hong Kong in 39 Everyday Objects. And of course, I'm appropriating the BBC's A History of the World in 100 Objects. And we know that those objects are all from the British Museum. And in this poem, all the objects, they made part of my life yeah. So here it goes. It's not really a poem that is meant to be read, but I'll see how it goes. A History of Hong Kong as 39 Everyday Objects. Things that's pastel-colored plastic plate / tea-colored plastic cup. Dai Pai Dong's toothpick / menu holder with the print of a beer brand. Cha Chan Tang's order pad with waiter's scribbles. Vitasoy glass bottle. turtle jelly china bowl, white paper cup with a maize field print, clay pot for clay pot rice, dim sum basket, tea-colored glass lazy Susan, long handheld barbecue fork, bamboo pole for scaffolding, bamboo bird cage, bamboo hatch/broom, lensless the white plimsolls/blue plastic flip-flops, suitcase, red, white, blue bag, postbox/traffic light control box from before 1997, orange rubbish bin, blue ribbon, street railing, yellow ribbon/umbrella, surgical mask. Metal folding chair with a circle wood print seat, rattan cane, Chonghua pencil, aeroplane chess/jungle the board game, mahjong, day calendar made of very thin paper, Tongxing the Chinese almanac, Kaotim stick, joystick, fortune cat a Japanese talisman, Faichen a Chinese New Year decoration, Lightsy the red envelope with a trademark, octopus card, plastic $10 note, coined with Bohemian's blossom, coin with the Queen's head, Miss Hong Kong's tiara. That's the first one. And from a historical poem to a short, brief love poem, you will realize that the poem I've read just now is a kind of list poem. And if you get to see this, it's more like an eye chart, which I envisioned. So I call this an eye chart poem in front of me. And it's not a poem I've read aloud before. And I chose it because as a creative writing teacher myself, the very first question that I would begin the whole course with, as Eddie and maybe others will agree with, what is poetry? So this could be an example to give a complicated answer to the question, or to not give an answer at all. Mile, pick, a surgery, kuchkon, birds me, but I, backed out, I saw myself in your eyes, two black holes. I was escaping you, your desire, as my heart leads, resists, in gravity. I backed away. You became a ghost, a bomb strong. The hell met the sun, a dying star. You can find a poem in Ink, Sweat, and Tears, and then you can see what I mean by an eye chart poem. Everything is capitalized, by the way, which is why it's so difficult to read it. So I guess the stereotypes that I was trying to break down first, what makes a poem, and maybe how a poem should be read aloud and how a poem should look like. So the following poems are all to do with Chinese cultures. And I guess these days, my main interest when I am writing in the poetic form is how there can be overlaps between Chinese and Western traditions, and also between Chinese and English languages. So I'm trying to look for a sense of balance between the two, and maybe a type of yin-yang between the two, which is the driving force behind all these poems that I've been publishing these days. So the first one, it was out in Emblephora, and it's called Cantonese Proverbs. Cantonese Proverbs. When a sow climbed a tree, you exposed your straight guts. Now you hang a goat's head on the wall, selling dog meat. In the island city, you're a double-headed snake with the dark face towards me. Checking you out, I dropped my bucket of crabs as if I ran into a ghost. My ghost blindfolds me. I wish yours would slap the back of your head. You're removing the plank you've used to reach the mainland. The old cat left on the bay is caterwauling. Its whiskers are burned. Let's see if you can make out those proverbs if you speak Cantonese. Chinese horoscopes. You grabbed my wrist to draw in the air, connecting 5 stars with my fingertip. That's your sign, and in the Chinese zodiac, a ghost riding in a flying carriage. We've drawn an upside-down Y, or the Chinese word for man, yan. But something broke through his legs, then the frames of our glasses. You made us make a wish, and I was, staring at your mold the whole time. Now we talk about prospects as we go down, the stairs until caution, slippery floor. I grab the handrail, my hands sweaty. I like to end with this poem, which does not have the word Chinese in it, but with the title, it already speaks some kind of Chineseness, I think. Self-portrait as a steamed whole fish. Fish in a still life are more dead than me on the hot peanut oil and soy sauce, topped with sliced ginger and spring onions. My eyeballs whiter than the oval plates I'm posed on. Sorry about that. Watched by a gold dragon, facing a gold phoenix. Your mouth's more open than mine, like I was a dead shark preserved in a glass case in an art gallery. The server cuts through me softly with the knife used to gesture to you that I'm ready. She says, "Manyong," literally, take it slowly. You learn to use chopsticks with his hands over yours. She's eyeballing you too. You, give up. He puts one piece of me on your tongue. The first time, you understand umami, the flavor of freshness. How's my skin taste? My eye on his saucer, fixed on yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Anthony, for the poems. Annie, I was wondering if you have any thoughts, comments, or questions that you want to ask Anthony.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. Those were really lovely poems. I think that you wrote quite, there's a bit of a difference between the poems that kind of explore structure and stereotypes around what a poem looks like, and also like the ones that kind of explore like stereotypes about Chinese diaspora life. Like as a Chinese diaspora poet, do you ever feel uneasy writing about kind of Chinese stereotypes? Because I definitely, when I'm writing poems, I'm kind of worried about playing into the stereotypes as I'm writing to try and break out of them. And I had quite an interesting conversation with a South Asian diaspora friend who was like, how do I write about mango trees without writing about mango trees? And do you ever feel similar?
I think I had that when I first started. I don't know, when I was trying to, maybe I was thinking too much about establishing myself as a poet. So I tried to avoid writing about anything which has associations with Chineseness or Chinese culture or Chinese traditions. But then as the years go by, and also as I've discovered so many Chinese or related poetic voices, like those in front of me right now, I realized that first of all, I shouldn't feel ashamed of writing about these things. And second of all, even within the Chinese community, we can approach these Chinese subjects and objects in our own ways, in our unique ways. So I guess the first thing we do is really to not think of ourselves as reinforcing these stereotypes. We are aware of them, we recognize them, but we also write about these things in our own ways. And there's nothing we should feel ashamed of, I guess. I'm not sure if I've answered that, but yeah, just write in our own ways.
Yeah, that was really interesting. I think it's a good answer. Yeah.
Thank you for that, Annie.
Yeah, thank you. Many thanks to our 4 poets for reading the poems and for saying a few things about stereotypes. I'm just wondering, I mean, we are doing quite well in terms of time. So we do have quite a bit of time here for questions or comments from the audience. I'm just wondering whether anyone in the audience might have questions to ask of our poets, maybe all the 4 poets in general, or maybe you might have questions directed at one specific poet. That's fine as well. And if you feel comfortable, you could just speak, right? And unmute yourselves and just ask the questions or comment on the poems. Or if you like, you could just type your questions or comments in the chat box, right? Anyone?
While we're waiting for somebody to put a comment, and I was just thinking about mangoes. You know, people always say like there's just one sort of mango, but there's not. There's so many different sorts of mango, and I think we should embrace that diversity of mango-ness, just in the same way as there's a diversity of Chinese heritage and all heritages really. But yeah, I just want to say there's lots of mangoes out there.
I completely agree. Yeah. If you speak to the Filipinos, they'll say that they export the mangoes which are not so nice to the rest of the world and keep the best for themselves.
I also want to say there's so much food in our poetry, and we don't feel ashamed of that, even though food is something characteristic maybe of Asian poetry. But there's peach in Eliot's poem, and I wrote about peach myself. So what's to be ashamed of?
Absolutely. Yeah. Go on, Jennifer.
Can I? Yeah, like thank you so much. Like such powerful poems and the dialogue between them. But yeah, one thing that I constantly feel a bit bothered is that there are lots of critics who feel that if people are writing anything to do with like all these motives, like for example, mango or family or food, as Antony mentioned, then the poems are very, it's not new enough, it's not exciting or experimental enough. But I think reading from your work, I don't feel that way. And, there's no need to limit oneself to the topics. But what do you think about that? And also in terms of racial stereotypes, I wonder if you feel as a writer, how do you break out from that sort of expectation as well from the reader? From both reader and critics.
Shall I just quickly jump in? I went to a really interesting event recently around publishing and gatekeeping, and whether certain people could only tell a certain sort of story because of publishing and gatekeeping. And I wonder whether that is changing, and it's certainly in I think in Britain it's changing, perhaps hasn't changed enough. But I imagine that experience is quite different in Hong Kong and Singapore. You're not being read through a certain sort of eye in the same way as maybe Annie and myself and Jennifer and people who are based in the UK are. So I was just wondering about that.
Yeah, I thought maybe to jump at that point, because when I didn't feel really qualified to talk about this talk on this panel, because I to be honest, as part of the majority race in Singapore, there isn't that much discrimination to talk about. So I thought it actually more useful to talk about a historical point of view. I think what I've tried to show is that poetry in Singapore does have that radical potential, and that maybe is true to poetry across the world and in the UK as well. It does have the radical potential to liberate points of view and to liberate others' points of view. I think that's the potential that we believe in, even against the expectations of audiences all over. That must something that we must continue to believe in. Poetry as a radical force in some ways.
Thanks. I just want to draw attention to the chat box. There's a question from Tim Cheng. Is there anything you try to write but find it difficult to work around with? I guess this is a question for everyone, right? For all of us. Anything that you you're dealing with, any topics that you find you need to engage with, but you feel that it's kind of difficult to handle?
I think generally quite topical poems, like poems about climate change or news events that have only quite recently happened. I think you can get commissions that ask you to write about them, but I don't know how I feel about them most of the time because they've just happened, or like they might give me a bit of anxiety. And yeah, I think those are probably quite difficult topics to write about. But I've definitely read a lot of very good climate change poems as well. It's just something that I personally find difficult to do. I don't know if the others have similar thoughts.
I'm tempted to say everything. But I think anything that might be out of my comfort zone in all different sense, or maybe something historical, because I need to make sure if there's anything factual, I need to get it right, unless I have framed it in an unreal or fantastical way or something like that. But staying true to the events that you're writing about, that might be a challenge.
Yeah, I totally relate to finding quite a lot of things difficult to talk about. One of the things I've been trying to do for ages, and I really find it hard to write about, is the erotic. And I think that's something to do with my generation and my background. There are some things that you shouldn't, I always brought out not to talk about. And I'm really admiring of LGBTQ poets and other poets of a younger generation who have no problems with speaking to the erotic. And I find that really, really interesting to hear those voices.
Yeah, that's a nice one. Maybe we'll just pick up on that. I find it very hard to write about my feelings because I'm not a confessional poet. So I don't write about if you read my poetry, I don't write about feelings or emotions. And I actually find it very awkward to do so. So maybe that's unexpected from a poet. But yeah, my poetry does not at all contain what I feel or think, except in a very oblique way. So that's the way I've gone around it.
Thanks. I do actually have a few questions, but before that, I just want to check whether there are any more. Do you have any questions from the audience? Are there any more questions that you might want to ask? Those of you in the audience. Okay, or maybe while you're thinking about this, let me just try to, maybe I should ask a hard question, right, of everyone of the poets here, just to make it a bit more challenging. I'm just wondering whether this is a reading on stereotypes and of course stereotypes. I think as I think it was Lisa or was it Annie who mentioned this, that it's about being simplistic, and it's about there are complications that are not being expressed and the complexities that are not being expressed, and everything is done in a very simplistic manner. But isn't it the case that everybody actually really works with stereotypes? And in fact, the stereotypes is the first thing that we think with. We think through stereotypes. We cannot help but think with stereotypes. When we encounter people, and after that we get past it. But our initial sort of understanding is, stereotypes, right? If I meet a person and I know that this person is a man, then I have stereotype of what this person is, right? He's a man, right? And then after, if I get to know this person, then I would get to know a little bit more of him, and maybe my stereotypes would be challenged and all of that, right? So we work through stereotypes, and isn't that in a way kind of reflective of your own poems as well? Antony was talking about the 39 objects in Hong Kong, and these are, in some ways, these are the typical objects, right? And you're using that. And I think, was it Annie, or sorry, I can't remember, Annie or Lisa, who was talking about imagined sisterhood, right? Or imaginary sisterhood. And, the idea of family, and I think Annie, Lisa as well, and I think Annie as well talked about Asia and maybe Asian motherhoods and parents and ancestry. And Daryl talked about Singlish, right? Isn't it? Singapore, Singlish, right? It's an immediate kind of thing. So I guess my question is, you know, isn't actually stereotypes, isn't that necessary? We need an obstacle in order to, then once we overcome that obstacle, we get a better understanding of ourselves, right? But isn't actually stereotypes, aren't they, you know, to some extent necessary in poetry and in writing and in creative writing? It's just a question.
Eddie, I think you put your finger on it when you said it's about overcoming it.
Yeah.
I mean, we all have to start in a place because you have to start somewhere, but it's the problem with a stereotype is when we stop there, isn't it? You know, we need to overcome it and move into the complexity that is life, because life is complex for, I think, pretty much everybody. I've never met anybody who's told me that life is simple and just one thing and easy, you know. So I hope we can, you know, I hope poetry especially, and really, you know, embraces that complexity, and we kind of we bring all of those things in to our work.
This is a difficult question, which, as you said, in some ways we are all in a category of one, right? Because we also all think of ourselves as unique and special and shaped by our circumstances. So in a way, my kind of Chinese is going to be very different from everyone else's here, and it's so different because it's so shaped by the different circumstances. And yet we also default to categories because they are a way of understanding the world. So I think what good sort of identity, sort of poetry, tries to reckon with the categories, but also tell people that there are complexities to them that they have not thought about and that they should think about. So you work within the categories, but you try and complicate them. You don't tell people that, you know, the categories are completely nonsense, because obviously there is some truth to them. But you try and work within them to help the reader, I think, understand that there's something else. And I thought the poem by Aaron Martin that I read about the Indian drink seller was that. He was really trying to say, you know, there are many types of Indian in Singapore. I'm Indian, but I'm not, you know, I don't speak Tamil, you know, so please understand that. And I think that's what good, I would say this is a political sort of poetry tries to do. It tries to complicate it, but it also tries to help people understand, I think.
Just one small thing to add to what we've said. Maybe there's a slight difference between what is typical and what is stereotypical. And if something is a stereotype, there might be certain negativity which is behind it. And if we are to break it down, I think we are trying to create a kind of force of resistance to something that might be established. I don't know if I always or often begin with that when I write something. It's more, sometimes I can't distinguish what we might be describing as stereotypical or typical and something traditional. Like if it's something that has been done that way, and if I'm not doing it that way, am I breaking down certain stereotypes, or am I just trying to find my unique way of writing and unique poetic voice? I really don't have an answer.
There is a question from the audience, I think.
Yep, sorry, Rini. Do you intentionally set out to write to challenge stereotypes, or do you find that it emerges as you write? From Rini to everyone. Yeah.
Annie, I was really interested in your soft boy poem, because that is definitely a stereotype that you chose to challenge quite face on. Yeah, I'd be really interested to hear your response to Rini's question.
Thank you. I think, like, how I think of stereotype is that it's quite unchallenging, like it doesn't really challenge the view that you already have of something, whereas I think you can kind of push a bit beyond it, and perhaps it doesn't quite become, you know, like a complex symbol or something. Is but it's more of a caricature, which is what I was trying to do in that poem for comedic purposes. But I think a more like humanizing way of writing stereotypes and kind of addressing stereotypes is to put a bit of truth into them and to add some depth to these people who, yes, might be quite annoying and behave in slightly strange ways, but also at the end of the day, like, they are human, and that's what makes them funny. And but yeah, and a bit more than two-dimensional.
Whoa, that's wait, let me just scroll back up a little bit. List one has a question. Thank you for all the brilliant music. I'd like to ask two questions, please. As many of you have spent time overseas, how has or have your experiences of diaspora shaped your identity? Did that make you feel closer or more distant from your homeland? Number two, how or where do you find the courage to get your work out there, especially when what you write is quite personal? Many thanks. So, question from Liz.
Definite yes. I did my master's and PhD in the UK, and those were the time when I was probably accumulating all these observations and experiences, which now I can return to and revisit, transform, do something about them in my poetic work. And I don't think my poetry will be this way without all these diasporic experiences.
Yeah, I grew up in the UK. I moved here when I was 3, and my brother was born in the UK, so I've never really lived in any other country. I've not even been abroad that much. I think I've been to China about 3 times. So I think that's quite a different experience growing up, especially in a fairly rural part of the UK. I was the only like Chinese diaspora person in my year at school, and I think that was quite freeing in the sense that it didn't always feel Chinese, but also quite kind of stifling in the sense that I didn't really feel white either, and it was a strange identity to grow up with. And I also grew up Anglican as well, which is another very white traditional kind of establishment, and trying to kind of marry the evensong, the ritual, and the kind of religious cultural aspect that's very English to some extent with kind of Chinese heritage can be quite confusing. And I think that confusion comes through in a lot of poems. Like, I'm not quite sure what I am, and now my friends are scattered around the world, and they're like Chinese, British, American now and stuff, and like, where does that put me? But yeah. Okay. So I think that is quite personal, my relationship to like my Chinese heritage, and that comes through in my work. But maybe it's less scary to write about, because a lot of other people growing up around the world, even if they aren't having the exact same experience as me, can relate to that. And it makes me feel less alone, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's that people around the world and how we're connected. In the last year, technology has really brought that home to me. I came to the UK as a teenager, but all my family have always lived in Malaysia. So, you know, it's, for me, was a real experience of disjuncture. It was an experience into a language where I lost a lot of my other language. I feel very much at home in the multilingualism of Malaysia and Singapore. I've been finding a new sense of home in my identity as a Teochew speaker, and that kind of diaspora community that's really been enabled quite a lot by a kind of diaspora community in the States coming through Thailand and Cambodia and Vietnam, which I find kind of really interesting. And that's all been enabled by technology. I wouldn't have had access to that 10 years ago. And in terms of courage, gosh, it's always really difficult, isn't it? But I decided if I never spoke, if I was never brave enough, I couldn't lend that courage to anybody else. You know, I very much have appreciated the courage people have lent me, and I wanted to lend my courage to others. So yeah, I guess that's what I would say to that.
Yeah, thanks very much. I was going to say to Lisa that you are Kakina. So
yeah, absolutely, definitely.
I really appreciate that. The Teochew, I think, is interesting because you speaking about that actually reminded me of something, helped me answer this question, which is, I mean, I studied in the UK for about 4 years. And then there was also this awareness of the histories of Chinese migration across the world. And that was fascinating to me to really think about that and how my Chineseness was not quite the same as the Chineseness of people born or who migrated early to the UK. So there was already some difference there. And then, of course, there was international background. And there were lots of other Chinese people from other Chinese parts of the world. And of course, Taiwanese, Hong Kong, and mainland Chineses are actually all very different. So I think that awareness helped me in my first book, actually, which is a book of changes, because that, in a way, was trying to make sense of the flows of people and histories of migration, and then how that general flow, how my family fits into that, and then how the story of Singapore in some ways fits into that, and trying to complicate the narratives involved. So I think that I would say is my answer to that question. Thank you, Liz.
Thanks, Liz. That was a great question. There's another question. How do you understand or represent Lgbqt gender in a way that challenges the reader? I mean, as in how to explore those issues, and given your own poetics or personal background, how do you do that as writers?
I think I have a kind of slightly different perspective on this, and perhaps nothing really to say. You know, I probably would identify as, well, I do identify as cisgender, and I use the traditional pronouns. So I probably don't really have anything to say to that, but I just wanted to name it, I guess.
Okay. All right. So just wondering if there are any more questions from the audience. If not, I've got a very general kind of question. Well, actually, yeah. Well, now that I'm looking at my list, maybe it's not so general. But I'm just wondering, if it is ever possible for someone or for a person or a culture to be free of stereotypes, both in the sense of being stereotyped and a sense of stereotyping others, right? I mean, can we ever get out of this thing? I mean, I know we work through these things and we start there and we go to beyond, but can we do away with that, and sometimes are there times when we ourselves might be stereotyping others without knowing that we are doing that, we are doing that.
I think probably tie this into the last question about gender too. I think when I'm writing about gender and women and men too, I'm always fairly, probably not whilst I'm writing the poem, but after I'm reading it, I'm careful about, like really playing into gender roles and like really cementing people. And I think when I'm writing about identities other than my own, I try and make sure that it's not one-dimensional either. And I think that as writers who aren't always writing about our own experiences, we have almost a kind of duty to our craft to try and you know, like construct these three-dimensional characters, and to our readers as well. I'm not sure if we can completely break free of these stereotypes. I think when people read a word, like, you know, images, symbols, things pop into their head and they make connections just based off that, and that's how language works, really. But we can kind of push stereotypes in strange ways. We're like flip stereotypes and kind of make people see them in a new way.
Yeah, I think we all have shorthands, and it's hopefully that we don't stay with the laziness of that first shorthand that we use, or we reach, or we come across when we come across something that we want to kind of just label to start us off. Yeah, I hope move through it and complicate it, as Annie says, make it rich, make it three-dimensional.
Yeah, I think my approach has always been, if we are to use the word breakdown, to break down the dichotomies. So that kind of answers the question about gender, and maybe even, or let's say when we are breaking down whatever types of stereotypes, we can, I remember, Annie, you were saying that poem about soft boys is actually something like a caricature. So we can make fun of the stereotypes. We can come up with a parody of that. We can admit to them in a self-aware way. I don't satirical way or something like that. But yeah, I think dichotomies of different kinds, and as I was saying, cultural ones as well. What makes something Chinese, or what makes something Asian, or what makes something like an English poem or a poem in English.
Right. Okay. Yeah, thank you. I think that's a signal. I mean, I'm looking at the chat box and Jennifer is typing, you know, so yep. Okay, I think this is all we have time for. I'm just very grateful for the conversation that we have just had, and for the poems as well. And many thanks to our audience as well for the questions. I think at the end, my takeaway actually from this is that yes, stereotypes will always be there, but we owe it to ourselves and to others to be critical, right? To a certain extent, to always be at work, to be very self-conscious and to be self-aware of stereotypes, and to be able to work through those stereotypes and not be lazy, I guess. As a person, or whether you're a writer, or whether you're just a person, right? We just need to work through stereotypes. Okay, thank you. Thanks, everyone.